Psychological method. We must start from the idea that in all her activity, nature aims at the creation of a self-evolving being. Can it be supposed that the whole of the animal kingdom is the byproduct of one line of work, the creation of man? This may be admitted in relation to mammals. We may even include in it all vertebrates. We can consider many lower forms as preparatory forms and so on. But what place shall we give the system of insects, which represent a world in themselves, and a world not less complex than the world of vertebrates? Can it be supposed that insects represent another line in the work of nature, a line not connected with the one which resulted in the creation of man but perhaps preceding it? Passing to facts, we must admit that insects are in no way a stage preparatory to the formation of man. Nor could they be regarded as the byproduct of human evolution. On the contrary, insects reveal in their structure and in the structure of their separate parts and organs, forms which are often more perfect than those of man or animals. We cannot help seeing that for certain forms of insect life which we observe, there is no explanation without very complicated hypotheses, which necessitate the recognition of a very rich past behind them and compel us to regard the present forms we observe as degenerated forms. This last consideration relates mainly to the organized communities of ants and bees. It is impossible to become acquainted with their lives without giving oneself up to emotional impressions of astonishment and bewilderment. Ants and bees alike, both call for our admiration by the wonderful completeness of their organization, and at the same time repel and frighten us, provoking a feeling of indefinable aversion, by the invariably cold reasoning which dominates their life. By the absolute impossibility for an individual to escape from the life cycle of the anthill or the beehive. We are terrified at the thought we may resemble them. What place do the communities of ants and bees occupy in the general scheme of things on Earth? How could they come into being such as we observe them? All observations of their life and their organization inevitably lead us to one conclusion. The original organization of the beehive and the anthill in the remote past undoubtedly required reasoning and logical intelligence of great power, although at the same time the further existence of both the beehive and the anthill do not require any intelligence or reasoning at all. How could this have happened? It could only have happened in one way. If ants or bees, or both, of course during different periods, had been intelligent and evolving beings, then lost their intelligence and their ability to evolve, this could only have happened because their intelligence went against their evolution. In other words, because in thinking that they were helping their evolution they managed in some way to arrest it. One may suppose that both ants and bees came from the great laboratory and were sent to Earth with the privilege and possibility of evolving. But after a long period of struggle and effort, both the one and the other renounced their privilege, ceased to evolve, or to be more exact, ceased to send forth an evolving current. After this, nature had to take her own measures, and after isolating them in a certain way, began a new experiment. If we admit the possibility of this, could we further suppose that the old legends of falls which preceded the fall of man relate to ants and bees? We may find ourselves disconcerted by their small size as compared to our own, but the size of living things is first of all a relative thing, and secondly it changes very easily in certain cases. In the case of certain classes of beings, for instance fish, amphibious animals, and insects, nature holds in her hands the threads that regulate their size and never lets these threads go. In other words, nature possesses the power to change the size of these living beings without altering anything in them, and can effect the change in one generation, simply by arresting their development at a certain stage. Everyone has seen small fish that look exactly like large fish, small frogs like large frogs, and so on. This is still more evident in the vegetable world. However, it is of course not a universal rule, and some beings such as man, and most of the higher mammals reach the largest size possible for them. Insects, ants and bees could probably be much larger than they are presently, although this point may be argued. It is possible that a change in size of the ant or bee would necessitate a considerable alteration of their inner organization. Neil deGrasse Tyson, in his series on the cosmos, an episode covering the Permian period, Lost Worlds of the Planet Earth, where he discusses the effect upon insects of oxygen levels and carbon dioxide. He notes that very small adjustments in these percentages can have tremendous effects upon the size of biological life on Earth. It is interesting to note here the legions of gigantic ants in Tibet recorded by Herodotus and Pliny, see Herodotus, History, Book 11 and Pliny, Natural History, Book 3. Or legends of the gold-digging ants of India which enriched the Persian Empire. It would of course be difficult to imagine Lucifer as a bee or the Titans as ants, but if we renounce for the moment the idea of the necessity for human form, the greater part of the difficulty disappears. The mistake of these non-human beings, the cause of their downfall, must inevitably have been of the same nature as the mistake made by Adam. They must have become convinced that they knew what was good and what was evil, must have believed that they themselves could act according to their understanding or logos. They renounced the idea of higher knowledge and the inner circle of life, placing their faith in their own knowledge, their own powers, their own understanding of the aims and purposes of their existence. However, this understanding was probably much more wrong, and their mistake much less naive than the mistake of Adam. The results of this mistake were probably so much more serious that ants and bees not only arrested their evolution in one cycle, but made it altogether impossible by altering their very being. The ordering of the life of both ants and bees, their ideal communistic organization, indicate the character and the form of their downfall. It may be imagined that at different times both bees and ants had reached a high, although very one-sided culture based entirely upon intellectual considerations of profit and utility, without any scope for imagination, without any esotericism or mysticism. They organized the whole of their life on the principle of a kind of Marxism, which may have seemed to them very exact and scientific. They realized the socialistic order of things, entirely subjugating the individual to the interests of the community according to their understanding of those interests. Destroying any possibility for an individual to develop and separate themselves from the general masses. Yet it was precisely this development of individuals and their separation from the general masses that constituted the aim of nature, and upon which the possibility of evolution was based. Neither the bees nor the ants wished to acknowledge this. They saw their aim in something else, they strove to subjugate nature. In some way or other they altered nature's plan, making the execution of this plan impossible. We must bear in mind that, as has been noted previously, every experiment of nature, every living being, and every living organism represents the expression of cosmic laws, a complex symbol or a complex hieroglyph. Having begun to alter their being, their life and form, bees and ants, taken as individuals, severed their connection with the laws of nature. Ceased to express these laws individually and began to express them collectively. Nature then altered their size, rendering them incapable of doing her any harm. In the course of time their thinking capacities, absolutely unnecessary in a well-organized anthill or beehive, became atrophied. Automatic habits began to be handed down from generation to generation in some chemical romance, and ants became the insects we know them as today. Bees even became useful. When observing an anthill or a beehive, we are struck by two things. First, by the amount of intelligence and calculation put into their primary organization, and secondly by the complete absence of intelligence in their activities. The intelligence put into this organization is very narrow and rigidly utilitarian. It calculated correctly within the given conditions, and saw nothing outside of these conditions. Yet even this intelligence was necessary only for the original calculation and estimation. Once started, the mechanism of a beehive or of an anthill does not require any intelligence. Automatic customs and habits were learnt and handed down, this ensured their being preserved unchanged. Intelligence is not only useless in a beehive or an anthill, it would even be dangerous and harmful. Intelligence could not hand down all the laws, rules, and methods of work with the same exactness from generation to generation. Intelligence could forget, could distort, or could add something new. Intelligence could again lead to mysticism, to the idea of higher intelligence, to the idea of esotericism. It was necessary therefore to banish intelligence from an ideal socialistic beehive or anthill as an element harmful to the community, which in fact it is. Of course there may have been a struggle, a period when the ancestors of ants or bees who had not yet lost the power of thinking saw the situation clearly, saw the inevitable beginning of degeneration and strove to fight against it. Trying to free the individual from its unconditional submission to the community. but the struggle was hopeless and could have no result. The iron laws of the anthill and beehive very soon dealt with the restless element, and after a few generations such recalcitrants probably ceased to be born. Then both the beehive and the anthill became ideal communistic states. In his book, The Life of the White Ant, Maurice Maeterlinck, translated by Alfred Sutro, published by George Allen and Unwin in London during 1927, refer to pages 17, 152 and 163, has collected interesting material about the life of these insects which are still more striking than ants and bees. At the very first attempts to study the life of white ants, Maeterlinck experiences the same strange emotional feeling spoken of previously. Quote, "It makes them almost our brothers, and from certain points of view causes these wretched insects, more so than the bee or any other living creature on earth, to become the heralds, perhaps the precursors of our own destiny." Further, Maeterlinck dwells upon the antiquity of the termites, which are much more ancient than man, and upon the number and great variety of their species. After this, Maeterlinck passes to what he calls the civilization of the termites. Quote, "Their civilization, which is the earliest of any, is the most curious, the most complex, the most intelligent, and in a sense the most logical and best fitted to the difficulties of existence, which has ever appeared before our own on this globe. From several points of view, this civilization, although fierce, sinister and often repulsive, is superior to that of the bee, of the ant, and even of man himself. In the termitory, the gods of communism become insatiable Molochs. The more they are given, the more they require. They persist in their demands until the individual is annihilated, and his misery complete. This appalling tyranny is unexampled among mankind. For while with us it at least benefits the few, in the termitory no one profits. The discipline is more ferocious than that of the Carmelites or Trappists. The voluntary submission to laws or regulations proceeding one knows not whence is unparalleled in any human society. A new form of fatality, perhaps the cruelest of all, the social fatality, to which we ourselves are drifting, has been added to those met already, and thought quite enough. There is no rest except in the last sleep of all. Illness is not tolerated and feebleness carries its own sentence of death. Communism is pushed to the limits of cannibalism and coprophagy. Quote, "Compelling the sacrifice and misery of the many for the advantage or happiness of none, and all of this in order that a kind of universal despair may be continued, renewed and multiplied so long as the world shall last. These cities of insects that appeared before we did, might almost serve as a caricature of ourselves, as a travesty of the earthly paradise to which most civilized people are tending." End quote. Maeterlinck shows by what sacrifices this ideal regime is bought. Quote, "They used to have wings, they have them no more. They had eyes, which they surrendered. They had a sex, they have sacrificed it." End quote. The only thing he omits to say is that before sacrificing wings, sight and sex the termites had to sacrifice their intelligence. In spite of all that has been said, the process through which the termite passes is called by Maeterlinck evolution. This comes about because, as has been said before, every change of form taking place over a long period of time is called evolution by modern thought. The power of this obligatory stereotype of pseudoscientific thinking is truly astounding. In the Middle Ages, philosophers and scientists had to make all their theories and discussions agree with the dogmas of the Church, and in our day the role of those dogmas is played by evolution. It is quite clear that thought cannot develop freely in these conditions. The idea of esotericism has a particularly important significance at the present stage of the development of the thought of humanity, because it makes quite unnecessary the idea of evolution in the ordinary sense of the word. It was said earlier what the word evolution may mean in the esoteric sense, namely the transformation of individuals. In this meaning alone, evolution cannot be confused with degeneration, as is constantly done by scientific thought, which regards even its own degeneration as evolution. The only way out of all the blind alleys created by both positivist and speculative thought lies in the psychological method. The psychological method is nothing other than the revaluation of all values from the point of view of their own psychological meaning and independently of the outer or accompanying facts on the basis of which they are generally judged. Facts may lie. The psychological meaning of a thing, or of an idea, cannot lie. Of course, it can also be understood wrongly, but this can be struggled against by studying and observing the mind that is our apparatus of cognition. Generally, the mind is regarded much too simply, without taking into account that the limits of useful action of the mind firstly are well known, and secondly are very restricted. The psychological method takes into consideration these limitations in the same way as we take into consideration in all ordinary circumstances of life, limitations of machines or instruments with which we have to work. If we examine something under a microscope, we take into consideration the power of the microscope. If we do some work with a particular instrument, we take into consideration properties and qualities of the instrument, its weight, sharpness, etc. The psychological method aims at doing the same in relation to our mind, that is, it aims at keeping the mind constantly in the field of view, and at regarding all conclusions and discoveries relative to the mind. From the point of view of the psychological method, there are no grounds for thinking that our mind, that is, our apparatus of cognition, is the only possible one or the best in existence. Equally, there are no grounds for thinking that all discovered truths and established truths will always remain truths. On the contrary, from the point of view of the psychological method, there can be no doubt that we shall have to discover many new truths, either entirely incomprehensible truths, the existence of which we never suspected, or truths fundamentally contradicting those which we have recognized until now. Of course, nothing is more terrifying and nothing is more inadmissible for all kinds of dogmatism. The psychological method destroys all old or new prejudices and superstitions. It does not allow thought to stop and remain contented with the attained results, no matter how tempting and pleasant these results may appear, and no matter how symmetrical and smooth all deductions made from them might be. The psychological method gives the possibility of re-examining many principles that have been considered as firmly and finally established, and it finds in them entirely new and unexpected meaning. The psychological method makes it possible in many cases to disregard facts or what are taken for facts, and allows us to see beyond facts. Although it is only a method, the psychological method nevertheless leads us in a very definite direction, namely towards the esoteric method, which is in reality an enlarged psychological method, though enlarged in that sense in which we cannot enlarge it by our own effort.